Good afternoon, everybody. If I unmute the microphone, it makes a world of difference. Welcome along. 33 years in 31 days, day 3. And we're looking at 1992. Thanks to all of those who've dropped a message so far. Good afternoon. Welcome along. We've got Jenny, we've got Chris, we've got Tracy, Mercedes. We've got plenty of people in. So nice to have you with us. Looking at 1992 today. Quite a lot to get in for this year, really. As I started looking at it, I thought, cracky, there was a lot happened this year, and a few things that I wanted to sort of relay. So we'll kick straight off. First and foremost, 1992. So I'm into my sort of post first full year. I'm working with the team at Withington at Charlton, and essentially at this time in policing nowadays, probationers often get a driving course very, very quickly. You were lucky to get a driving course before 2 years. Generally, not until you'd finished your probation did you get a driving course. So that means foot patrol. And that was what I was posted to. So I was on foot patrol. I would do Withington Town Centre. I would do Didsbury Village when I was working out of Withington, or I would do Charlton Town Centre if I was working out of Charlton Station. But I started at Withington. That's where I was. I was doing Withington and Didsbury. And that was what you did. And so you'd be walking around, you'd been in and out of the shops, and then, as we said yesterday, sometimes there might be a job where you'd get picked up and taken to it because it would be beneficial for you to experience that kind of job. The example we had yesterday was a sudden death. If a sudden death came up, it was one of those things that probationers had to tick off. I've been to and dealt with a sudden death. So if one came in, they'd often say, well, it's miles off my patch and my foot beat, but pick him up, take him to that job because Neil can deal with it, or whoever that happens to be. Ivy, good afternoon as well. Welcome along. So foot patrol was what we were doing. Mostly in the early days, I was at Withington, but then I started to get pushed towards Didsbury. And there was, if you were assigned foot patrol, it would be frowned upon if the sergeant saw you in a car or the van. So if you might be able to arrange getting dropped off on the beat, and maybe even getting picked up off your beat to come back. But if the sergeant was out and about and saw that you'd got in a Panda and were just resting your legs and having a drive around with one of the older PCs, you'd be for it. So I made it part of my sort of practice that I would always walk to my beat. And so what I used to do is when I was on Didsbury, I would walk out along the main road, if people know the area, along Wimslow Road, past Christie's Hospital, big cancer hospital, and what have you. But then it's just a big long road, main road, all the way. There's houses and some and stuff, but it's fairly dull. So I used to cut off and go down a side street and into a park, and I'd cut through the park and down some back streets and end up coming into Didsbury Village from another direction. And one of the things that I used to do is the street that I walked up, I was walking down there one day, and there's this chap, and he was pushing a kid in a go-kart, and he looked up and he smiled at me, said, "Oh, hello," and I said, "Oh, morning," and carried on. And I saw him a few times, and it was only sort of like the second or third time that I saw him and he said hello that I realised that it was Richard Madeley of TV, Judy Finnegan, Granada Reports. He was a local TV person, I think, at the time. They did go national, didn't they? And there were other stories with Richard Madeley on our division as well. But it was walking past his house. I used to bump into him quite a lot as I was sort of walking up to the park to cut through. But occasionally, if you weren't on foot patrol, and especially on nights, it was rare that you'd be put on foot patrol on nights. On nights, you would normally be doubled up, and you were doubled up in one of the Pandas with one of the officers. And this is a story that I wrote a blog about many years ago. But I've been doubled up with a guy called Nigel, and we were on night shift. I think the night shift then started at 9 o'clock. I think we did 9 sevens, and we did 7 back-to-back nights, and then we had 6 days off. And they were a killer. They really were. But jumped in the van with Nigel, and we went out on patrol. And as we drove out of Withington and round in the circle and came back into Withington. As we're coming back into Withington towards one of the roundabouts, there was this lady sat on a bench just by the roundabout in the town, leaning out and leaning off this bench and waving her arms, and she looked as though she was in some sort of distress. So we pulled over, and she was absolutely leathered. Couldn't get a word out of her. She was talking, but her whole diction was completely unintelligible. It was just, yeah. It was, you just couldn't make any sense out of it. We stood there thinking about what we're going to do with this. Now we've stopped. We can't just ignore it. We're going to have to deal with this and the rest of it. And we ended up, Nigel said, well, it's your job. Get on with it, make a decision. I'm just driving you around at the minute. So what are you going to do with it? So in the end, and many cops who watch this will laugh at this point, because having been a custody sergeant as well for 7 years, but I locked her up for drunk and incapable. And we put her in the van and we took her to custody. And the expected, or what I wasn't expecting, but what I know many cops will understand, is that the expected outcome was a custody sergeant just looked at me and, she's not coming in here, take her to hospital. So I took her to hospital, and Nigel then left me and said, right, I'm going to carry on and do some work. You're just going to have to sit here with her now while the nurses see her. And it took hours for the nurses to see her. They referred her for a mental health assessment. It took hours for the psych to come down. And when the duty psych came down, he looked at her for about 3 minutes and said, I can't assess her. She's drunk and I'm not doing anything with it. There's nothing the matter with her. She had no ID on her, nothing. But ultimately, and she wasn't getting any better, but ultimately we managed to locate an address, and at 3 o'clock or so in the morning, this is still going on, been at it for 6 hours now. At 3 o'clock or so in the morning, we knock on the door and we find her mum. And her mum said she wouldn't have her. She said she doesn't live here, but we're trying to get help for her, but nobody will, and she just drinks herself silly. And she still couldn't speak, mostly unintelligible nonsense, couldn't get any sense out of her whatsoever. But Mum said there's a street down that way, and it's all terrace houses, and halfway along there's a red door, and it looks really scruffy. I think she's been dossing there. In amongst all her property, we found a key. So we decided to go down to this street. We went down to the street and had a look and found this really scruffy red door and thought, well, in for a penny, in for a pound, put the key in the door, and it opened. Hallelujah. So we knocked and made a lot of noise and nobody came in. And this lady, Nora, as she came to, as I knew her by, which is her name actually, I won't give her surname, but Nora. And bearing in mind that this is 1992, and you think, would you do things differently in 2020 and 2021? Yeah, we would. But we had no other options open to us. Couldn't do anything with her. She hadn't committed any other offences. We were just trying to offload her somewhere where she would be safe. And we couldn't find anybody else in the address. But when we went into the front room downstairs, there was a bed laid out. It was relatively tidy. And so we brought her in. We plonked her in the bed, covered her up with a duvet. She went off to sleep, and we left. The ramifications of that, when I look back on it now, are horrific, because you think you've had police involvement. What if she vomits, chokes on a vomit, dies? There's a whole investigation that would go on there now with regard to police contact and whether that led to a death. But really, it was like 5 o'clock in the morning by the time I'd finished that, and about the end of that shift I was like, don't want any more of that. And I used to dread seeing Nora in the town, because if you saw her and you had to deal with it, it could take hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. But if we jump to quite many years in advance, because I never really, once I saw her occasionally, but then she just sort of disappeared off the radar and I didn't really see much of her. But if we jump way into the future, when I was on the traffic unit, I was driving past the DSS office one day, and a job came up on the radio and said there's somebody causing a disturbance and won't leave. And I was right by it, and I thought, I'll go. So I shouted up. I said, yeah, I'm just around the corner, I'll go. And I pulled up outside and I walked in, and a member of staff met me and they said, there's this lady and it's to do with a benefit, and she's argumentative and she won't listen to us and she won't leave, and we can't do anything for her today. We told her it's got to be tomorrow and all this of it. And I said, what's her name? And she said, Nora. And at that point, I just froze. I was like, oh my goodness, it's Nora. And I thought, I volunteered for this job and it's going to be a nightmare. And I opened this door with some trepidation, not knowing what I was going to find. And I opened the door and the lady was sat there, hair all combed through, fairly clean looking. I said, blimey, I haven't seen you in a long time. That was the first time ever that I'd ever heard her utter words that could be understood. I haven't seen you for a long time. We exchanged greetings, and I said, I believe there's a problem with your social. And she said, I'll come back and sort it tomorrow. And she looked at the lady that had come in with me, and she said, I caused him far too much mine many years ago. She said, I'm not going to cause him any now. And she put her arm through mine and walked out with me and said her goodbyes and walked off. And I never, ever saw her again after that. I never saw her again. But that was certainly a learning curve for me dealing with Nora on that night. One of the other things that happens in that year is that on one of the post-foundation courses at Sedgley Park, we're all sat in the class one day, we're all minding our own business, and one of the sergeants comes in and he says, oh right, he says, yeah, I'm going to be taking over now, and blah, blah, blah. Neil, you need to go and see the chief inspector wants to see you. Oddly, it was a real thing for me for years that I really struggled with. Chief inspector rank onwards, I really struggled at that point of thinking I'm in the poo, something's gone wrong, and I was quite nervous of the rank, petrified that I had to go and see the chief inspector at the training school. What the heck had I done? What? And turns out that he calls me in and he wanted to praise me for the presentation of my PDP, that blue book that I showed you yesterday that we carried with us everywhere and filled in. And he called me in and said, he gave me my PDP back, and he said, I just wanted to speak to you and say, well done, your presentation of your PDP. All these tabs make it really easy for me to find what it is that I'm looking for, so I can sign everything up and get it all done. He said, and I just wanted to say thank you to you for that and all the rest of it. And so there we go. That was what I'd done. If you can see, it's nothing clever, but I'd just put cardboard tabs down it, and it just meant that they could find stuff quite easily and you could go to it. But I got praised for my PDP. But it was quite bizarre. It was really quite bizarre, because I'm thinking, oh, what's happened? And you knock on the door and you think, oh God. And lo and behold, he wanted to praise me for something. Chief inspectors were in another department were an issue as well. I'll come to that one in a minute. The other thing that I just sort of mentioned is that is just sort of novelty factor really, is that obviously we were reporting crime and doing stuff at that time. The crime reports in Greater Manchester at that time were like an A4 size piece of paper, landscape, and in quadruplicate, and they were carbonating right the way through. We used to fill them in, and you'd fill it in and you'd write up your initial report on it, and then you'd put it in a tray and it would go off, because I was at Withington, so you put it in a tray and it would get taken to Didsbury where CID were. and the DCI or the DI at Didsbury would review your crime, write some notes on it, and then send it back to you. And you ended up with continuation sheets with your inquiry saying, I've done this and I've done that, and I spoke to them, and the statement is attached, and blah, 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 or I've charged this prisoner and this can be filed, or whatever it happened to be. But the one thing that you really did not want on your crime reports was when it came back, because the DCI or the DI would write on the crime and send it back to you, and it'd end up in your tray, and you pick it up and you go, oh, why has this come back? And you open it up and you just get to the last entry from the DCI, and it says, see me. Used to sort of instill fear in you, because you're like, oh, what have I got to see the DCI for? And sometimes you couldn't read his handwriting. His handwriting was so bad, you couldn't read it. And it was even worse when you had to go to Didsbury to CID to see the DCI and say, sir, I can't read what you've written. Oh, God, it was a nightmare. Anyway, you never wanted to see me. So then another thing then, as a foot patrol officer, if they can divert you to anything that avoids them having to lose a mobile response car and a cop that's driving the car, making them unavailable, they will deploy you to. So I was doing scene guards, I was doing scene guards, observations, all those kind of things. And as we said, sudden deaths they might pull you off to, or what have you, or some different kind of job came in, they'd get you involved. And one of the jobs that I was doing, we had a girl that had been subject to a really nasty domestic assault, and it had been dealt with and done and sorted, and the offender was unknown, and she'd been attacked at her home. And then either the next night or very close to that, she was attacked again at home, and that second attack brought CID involvement into it. CID were all over it, and so they set up an observations point in a house across the road, an empty house. They'd gone to the estate agent and said, come have the keys, we want to go on the first floor and just watch that house. Of course you can. No, so we got the keys. Where does PC Smith end up? In the greenhouse in the back garden, in the middle of the night. I'm sat in a greenhouse, shivering, freezing cold, a radio right on minimum volume, but still sounds really loud. And I sat in the greenhouse for a good chunk of that night. And the worst moment of the whole thing was at one point I'm sat there and I'm minding my own business and just listening. I can hear footsteps in undergrowth. And I'm thinking, suspect's coming, he's coming. I thought, got my hand over the radio to kind of muffle the sound from the patrols doing other jobs and all the rest of it. And fortunately, I got very close to it, but I didn't shout up. But I'm still waiting and waiting. I think, I don't know what that noise is. I don't know what it is. It sounds like footprints, and my heart was beating like boom, boom, boom. It was a cat. It was coming through the undergrowth at the side of the greenhouse, and it scared the life out of me. But it was a cat. But then the other sort of big moment for 1992 then was the fact that I was actually signed up and confirmed an appointment in 1992. Should have been February 1993. But it was a rather embarrassing scenario because I'd left it late. I suddenly got a memo that said, contact Chief Inspector Sloan. He wants to see you on this date at this time because he wants to see your PDP and sign you up. And I was like, oh, sugar. I hadn't finished it. My inspector hadn't signed it up. And this was unheard of at the time. I had to ring my inspector at home. And he wasn't home, but his wife was home, and she ran to get the phone and fell over and hurt herself. And then I was saying, I needed to speak to him because I need him to sign something. Obviously, cut a very long story short, we had a wedding coming up that weekend, and I had to take my PDP to the wedding in a bag and give it to the inspector. I was so embarrassed. Give it to him so that he could take it away and sign it and then send it on to the chief inspector. So it went to the chief inspector. Again, I had to go and have my meeting with the with Chief Inspector Sloan, and nervous as heck about that. But he was very pleasant, signed me up. Thank you very much, Neil. You're in, and what have you. And the final thing that needed to be done was that you need the superintendent to just sort of sign you off as well. So I'm signed off by the chief inspector, I'm signed off by the chief inspector of the training school, and I just need the divisional super to sign me up. And that meant a meeting with him and my inspector. And this is one of the defining moments in my police career, because the superintendent called us into his office. We sat down, and he just went at me, straight at me, red-faced, argumentative, shouting, blah, 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 blah. His whole beef appeared to be around the fact that he thought I wasn't arresting enough people. Nobody had said to me throughout the time, Neil, you need to arrest more people. You've not arrested enough people, blah, 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 blah. I would often be in the town centre on Withington on foot patrol, and I'd be saying, look, somebody who's getting rowdy and out of hand, I'd be saying, look, you'll get locked up, but you've had a good night, you've enjoyed yourself, just walk home. Calm down, just get out of here. I was on prevention rather than locking up, where some cops would just jump in and lock up. I think that was probably, I wouldn't say it was my fault, but I think that was the reason, one of the reasons why I wasn't bringing as many people in circumstances like that others might. But he tore a strip off me. The inspector just sat there and didn't say anything. And then he stamped up the form, which I've just shown you. He signed it, and so I knew I was in. But it's as though he wanted his pound of flesh. And I got up and I walked out, and I committed to myself there and then that from that point on in my career, nobody, no matter how many crowns, pips, or whatever they had on their shoulders, would ever speak to me like that again. And if they wanted to give me for want of a better word, if they wanted to give me a bollocking, they could give me one, but they weren't going to speak to me like that. And I said, I promised myself that if anybody spoke to me like that again, I would say to them, look, you don't need to speak to me like that. And if you're going to speak like that, I'll come back when you're calm. And I'd get up and walk out. And fortunately, I never, ever had to do that again. But it was an awful, awful experience. So that then jumps into 1993, really, because then you're finally appointed in 1993. But I was signed up at the end of December 1992. The final thing, just to finish off 1992, was, as we said, if there was a job that I could do or the other foot patrol officers could do that would prevent the staffing strength losing a panda, well, then they would put you on it. And the division at that time had come up with something called the crime car, and that was staffed by a uniform officer and a detective in a plain car, and you went out to crime matters. Initially, the idea was that you would be looked at with regard to dealing with robberies and the more serious crime matters. But as time went on, they started to look and say, well, that burglary is a crime, so go and deal with that. And then that shoplifter is a crime, and you're the crime car, go and deal with that. It became a bit of a burden, and it wasn't working. The CID didn't want to be on it, and the PCs that they were putting on it were all probationers because they didn't want to lose a panda. Reasonable experience for me, but I was on the crime car at Christmas that year, and I was working the crime car on Christmas Eve on late shifts. And I think we probably paraded on at 12 or 1 o'clock or whatever, and we're doing some work and we did some crime and all the rest of it. And then we had refs at, I don't know, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock, something like that, probably 6. We had refs, and then the detective, I was in the CID office, and the detective I was working with, and I'm still a bit wet behind the ears with regard to these departments. Detectives, I said, have you got plain clothes with you? So I said, yeah, I have actually. I've got some plain clothes. He said, good. He said, go and put them on. So, oh, got a job on. All right. So I disappeared and I got some plain clothes on and all the rest of it. At which point, there's a few detectives all together. and he shouted up on the radio at that point and said, "Yeah, we're going off on inquiries now, and I'll be on my pager if you need me." Yeah, Roger, thank you. Blah blah blah. Boom. Went to the pub. I didn't know where to put myself or what to do. So, what in those times, 1992, what do? You go with the flow and don't make a wave. Would I deal with it differently these days? Yeah, probably would. But the CID were pretty much known that they went to the pub, and it was a thing. And so, out Christmas Eve, I was in the pub, and it bizarre. But there you go. That's what we did that Christmas. I don't think I ever did that again. But attitudes and things started to change over the years, and so that sort of stuff that was a hang-on from decades past. If you think life on Mars and going to the pub and all that kind of stuff, it was a hang-on from that, and it still went on, but it was right at the dog end of coming to a natural finish. But it was a most bizarre experience where somebody said, "Going where?" And so I just went along because I thought otherwise I'm going to look like a complete, turnip. But there we go. That's it. 1992. So as I said, we're looking at foot patrol. One of the things I used to do on my foot patrol, I used to get the bus back from Didsbury. If I'd walked out to Didsbury when I came back from my refs, I would get on the bus, and the bus would come into the village, and I'd just jump on, as all the normal passengers would get on and get off, and then I'd just jump on and talk to the driver and say, "Drop me off in Withington." You go, "Yeah, yeah," and you have a chat with the driver and build some relations up with the driver and say hello to a few people on the bus and get off and yeah. So Richard Madeley, Nora, and the experiences with her. God, I wonder where she is now. God bless her. Scared to death of the chief inspector and the detective chief inspector. And hiding in a greenhouse, being scared to death of a cat. Not my greatest moment. Anyway, folks, that's it. 33 years in 31 days. Day 3 is done. I will be live tomorrow. What day are we on tomorrow? Monday. Probably around, I'll set it up tomorrow morning, just when I know how my day's going for, but probably around about 4 or 5 o'clock, probably, or maybe even a little later, depending on how things go. But tomorrow evening, at some point, late afternoon or tomorrow evening, will be 1993. As we move on through these 30 years of policing. So thanks for dropping in. Nice to see you. Thanks for the comments and stuff. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Until then, thanks for dropping in. Replay viewers, thank you for coming in and watching too. And until then, hope to see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.